Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary podcast is for you.
Smiley had to cross a line. He had to go out on a limb. We had to see him exposed. In the first Smiley story ever, he gets beaten up by Munt. He does expose himself to danger. But at this point, he's already not allowed to do that. Quite clearly, he knows too much. He can't afford to be captured. So he's crossing a line. I wanted to expose him to jeopardy directly.
What happens when a son inherits the literary legacy of his father? Especially when that father happens to be the master spy writer, John le Carré. Nick Harkaway has published Karla's Choice, a John le Carré novel. He grappled with the question of how he could honor his father's legacy and how he could bring back George Smiley. In today's conversation, I recruited two of the finest John le Carré scholars I know, Steve Ritterman, who's been reading le Carré for 40 years, and Matthew Bradford. We spent an hour with Mr. Harkaway, talking all about Karla's Choice and the return of George Smiley. And welcome to the Spybrary podcast, Mr. Nick Harkaway. How are you, sir?
I am very well. How are you?
Oh, really, really excited. We're all tremendously excited for this interview. It goes without saying that the vast majority of our listeners and followers around the world at Spybrary are huge fans of your late father's work, and they're all excited to get into Karla's Choice, which we're going to talk about today. We're joined by two of the finest Spybrarians I could recruit for this operation. They know so much about the le Carré universe and the world of the circus. That is Stephen Ritterman and Matthew Bradford. Welcome to Spybrary, gentlemen.
Very nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane.
All right, Stephen. So let's kick off with yourself. What's top of mind?
All right, Nick, why don't we just start really at the beginning? In your Silverview afterward, you pondered your possible involvement in completing the novel by saying, quote, "Like my father, I have a capacity for mimicry, but to deploy it at scale to counterfeit his voice across 300 pages if the book required it, could I even approach that?" 3 years later, you've answered your own question by writing Karla's Choice and including the epigraph loosely attributed to Picasso saying, "I can fake a Picasso as well as anyone." So I guess my question, Nick, is what happened in the interim 3 years that so emboldened you to go down this path?
I wrote a couple more books. I learned a lot more from doing that. But also, so first of all, I should say the Picasso quote is about Picasso faking his own work. It's a great story. Do you know it? So the story is that they had a whole exposition and they got Picasso in and his gallerist was there and they had a bunch of Picasso works that they wanted to authenticate. And he was sitting there going, yeah, no. And no, and so on. And after a while, the gallerist said, "I saw you paint that one you just put in the no pile, like I was there." And he said, "Yeah, but I can fake a Picasso as well as anybody." And they realized he was picking the ones he liked and putting them on the yes pile, and all the no's were just like, "Yeah, no, I don't think so." What it made me think of was the kind of the attitude to authenticity. He's kind of sitting there going, "Yeah, this is the authentic Picasso. I don't know who painted it, but this is great." And I really liked that for this moment, because it made me feel that, if Picasso could think he faked a Picasso, then maybe, I have a chance at producing something here that is in the zone. So I guess what changed, the first thing that changed is, my brother asked me to do it. And everything, all the reasons why you would say no, when you're asking yourself that question, potentially become yeses when someone else asks you. It's a huge thing to take on. It's this incredibly important sequence of stories in the 20th century. It would be an undertaking that would require you to learn and change. And suddenly you're thinking, but if I'm being asked to do that, those are all positives. This becomes an opportunity rather than something that you should say no to. And I guess that, that really ultimately is it. And then when we had the conversation, I sat down, I said, "Can I have 2 weeks?" I sat down quite heavily. I said, "Can I have 2 weeks to actually work out whether this is even remotely possible?" And I read the books, all of them, and I thought, okay. And I started writing little chunks, not connected to anything, but just little snippets to see whether whether it was possible. And it was. So then I began in earnest. So I'm not sure what happened. I think maybe what happened is I kind of would finally ask the question.
Well, it's interesting that, because we read in the book of letters that your brother assembled, fantastic book, A Private Spy, of your father's letters, about what he had been working on at the time he passed away, which also sought to fill in some of the gaps in the Smiley timeline. Was that an inspiration for Karla's choice? And did you end up incorporating any of the things that he had started into that?
So I've seen those documents, and they are documents, those little snippets, and they are amazing and they are fascinating. They don't fill in any of the gaps, and they're not, to me, they aren't coherent enough of themselves to become a single story, or, each of them could be a story by itself. But they're quite, like Legacy of Spies, they're quite outside the kind of original Tinker Tailor continuity. They sit in, so they're fascinating. But so they didn't form any kind of basis for this. I looked at that and sort of, it didn't go that way. What did form a basis for this was a couple of stories that my father used to tell about real world events in the realm of espionage of the 20th century, which he kind of wanted to put into stories or felt were great stories, but never did. And so there's a couple of things in here, but most notably the arrival of Mickey Bortnick, and he says, I'm supposed to be conducting an assassination, but I've changed my mind, which is the very beginning of the book. That is, there's a real life event. There was notoriously a Russian assassin who did that, and the lady of the house opened the door. He says, "I'm here to kill your husband." And she says, "Oh, well, you better come inside." And we kind of assumed that she knew he meant, "and I'm not going to."
That's a great story. I can see why you wanted to incorporate that.
And so I built on, I had this extraordinary trove of the stories that my dad used to tell, and a couple of things that happened while I was with him, which I can't get into because spoilers. So I have these, there are no le Carré lines in the book, no kind of storylines that he proposed or anything like that, but there are things that he loved.
Let me ask you a question, Nick. One of the reasons I believe Karla's choice succeeds as it does is that you didn't take the easy way out by just simply writing a heretofore unknown Karla versus Smiley story. Instead, you wrote a novel that fits seamlessly between two of your father's most iconic titles and fills a hole in the Smiley timeline that really wasn't readily apparent. My question is, how did you come upon this idea? Was it solely yours, or did it in part stem from some of the ideas your father was rumored to have worked on?
So I went through the continuity of the books, and one of the things that becomes apparent, you guys will know this, is that he wasn't writing a franchise. So there are gaps. There are places where the dates don't quite match and so on. That doesn't matter. And in a sense, it gives you a great freedom to work with. And I have a kind of putative timeline of when does Percy Alaline accidentally start a war in the Middle East? And, when are these events taking place? But it's speculative because most of those events don't hook onto anything very firmly. But what is clear is that there is this gap between Spy Came from the Cold, which doesn't mention Karla, and then Tinker Tailor, where Karla's been there all along. And you've got a 9-year or somewhere between 8 and 10-year gap in which some of the most critical events that lead up to the Tinker Tailor sequence must happen. And yet we don't really know what they are. There's a sort of general fog of espionage that exists. And you notice it as well in reference to real world events. Like the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't think makes an appearance as a past event in the Smiley continuity. There's a generalized Cold War paranoia, but the specific events, JFK assassination isn't particularly there. They're not there. So we have a kind of endless, constant French war in which we can interpolate any number of events, and they make sense because the two sides are at loggerheads, but they're not, that most of them are not explicit. So into working into that space was just immediately creatively the thing to do, because you have enough room to tell stories that, as you say, belong to themselves. And that's where you want to be. There's also potentially a gap after Honourable Schoolboy before Smiley's People, because Smiley's People is sort of mostly undated. But Smiley's head of the circus, he's interim chief. It doesn't feel as much, once you become the boss, the constraints are different. When he's operating alone in this way, or he's under authority, it's a more attractive kind of scenario for me.
It's really interesting what you say about your dad not being necessarily consistent with all of his details and characters, because nerds like us really kind of follow that stuff, and as you say, it gives you a lot of freedom. I was wondering, since he wasn't always so consistent, and in one of those letters in A Private Spy, he says that he didn't even reread his past books preparing for Legacy of Spies, but you have, as you just said. So you have to reconcile all these different alternate versions, and as you say, you had a lot of freedom. You could have gone various ways. So it's interesting to me that you returned kind of a more classic Connie to us than the younger one that had cameoed in Legacy of Spies. But then you lean into a Millie McCraig, who's more like the Legacy of Spies Millie that I had found more like sort of Ailsa Brimley before. Do you see her becoming like the Tinker Tailor Millie McCraig and disapproving of Smiley over time? Do you think those are stories you might fill in and show that change, or was it just more convenient to use that one? Or
I think that's a plausible shape for her. I mean, I also don't have a specific plan. I mean, I have a kind of an overarching sense of how it will go if I write more of these. But I don't have a kind of an agenda for everybody. And I feel like that's a kind of a better way to go. I just liked Millie McCraig. It was that simple. And I liked the Millie McCraig in Legacy. Legacy is, I mean, from a continuity point of view, it's problematic. As you say, he did not reread the old book before he started. And I think effectively what he did was shift the constellation of the circus, which is present in, let's say, 1969, 1970, and just backdate it a decade, which is fine up to a point. But it produces, and first of all, we also know that those characters aren't in London because they're doing other things which are referred to, but also it produces a kind of series of knock-on narrative effects, which I think are not ideal if you're actually working to Tinker Tailor. And indeed, my copy editor, when we were copy editing Karla's Choice, she produced a kind of extraordinary continuity map, kind of say, this is, what about this and what about this, which is a series of paragraphs about like things you need to know. And at the bottom, there's a sort of note that says, Legacy of Spies is just out there, and we just kind of can't reconcile it. And so what I actually did in the end was I abandoned the architecture of the circus that's in Legacy of Spies in favor of the one that is posited in Tinker Tailor and Honourable Schoolboy, and retained the events that take place in Legacy as the run-up to Spy Came from the Cold, which makes perfect sense. The weird thing about Legacy is how much of it dovetails perfectly with the Tinker Tailor shape of things, so long as you are prepared to just abandon some of the superficial architecture of it. Just say, these are the core events, and they fit perfectly into the timeline. But, as I say, like at some point in this decade, Percy Adeline is busy screwing up the world somewhere else. So he can't be in London. The Joint Steering Committee is Bill Hayden's invention, so that doesn't really make sense if it's already in place at this time. So you just kind of recognize that those changes or those decisions made perfect sense in the context of Legacy, which is a kind of permanent now. But as long as we're dealing with trying to fit something into the established Tinker Tailor space, which I think is the sweet spot, but it's like what we all want more of. It's what I want more of. So, I just generalize, assume that's everyone. Then this is what you do.
Do you have a favorite character other than Smiley from the circus universe? Because that's what I really loved about this work. It was like a reunion of the friends and fiends of that world. Who are some of your favorites?
I do have a big soft spot for Toby Esterhazy. I just do. And he gets a little bit more kind of a little bit more of himself. Basically everybody who comes up in Karla's Choice is a pre-existing character. the brief has to be you get fractionally more of them, so you feel like you're getting the world revealed. While at the same time, kind of no true secrets are ever properly uncovered. The great question is, how is Toby recruited? What's his track? We know Smiley finds him in a flat squat in Vienna. That's in the book somewhere. I don't even remember where. That's a great story, right there. And that's probably in the 50s. There's no point going back, but we can at least we could have that story. Do I have any other favorites? But always, I actually kind of would love to do a little bit more with Percy Alaline, because everybody hates him so much, so he's instantly interesting to me. And then Roy Bland barely gets a proper kind of reality to his life in Tinker Tailor, and he's a central character, so there's an opportunity there not only to kind of explore Bland, but also to, to kind of do something that is, makes the balancing of Tinker Tailor feel more kind of, it could be you, it could be you, it could be you, it could be you. Because as you're reading Tinker Tailor, Bland, I think, is the one who maybe isn't an obvious suspect, because you don't know him, you don't feel he's as strong as the others, maybe, although that could just be my prejudice.
Nick, and let me just pick up on that. I wasn't going to get into this now, but to pick up on Shane's point, that really was one of the great parts of the book, is just to see how you trotted out all the old characters. And to very much your point, we pretty much see everyone, but no Roy Bland. And I was just wondering, is he off like doing some sort of adventure in Eastern Europe, or do you just not like him?
No, I like him. But I think he, at this point, he's slightly younger than the others, and he's probably kind of, as you say, he has this very discrete task of being the socialist lecturer. He's definitely very much still in the field at this point. As with Alaline, he's out there doing the thing. Bill Hayden in this book is only passing through town. He is not, he is not permanently in London. So we get a taste of him just because he's so much fun to write, really. But then you've got, as you say, you've got Esterhazy, because the Lamplighters are based in Acton, so they're a fixture. They get deployed around the place. But Roy is at this point probably, as you say, he's probably going from university to university in the Eastern Bloc, lecturing on British socialism and the need for ties across the continent, and at the same time spying on everybody.
Let me just follow up on that for a second, because, you just brought up something that I found very interesting in the book, because you've done something here really that your father never did. And that was by taking the story back pre-Operation Testify, you sort of use that literary device of dramatic irony, where we, the reader, now know things that the Circus doesn't. And what they start to suspect, we already know. And I can't speak for everyone else, but I know when you had a critical meeting and Bill was invited, I was screaming, no, don't do this.
Yeah.
So the question is, did you enjoy this little sleight of hand? Was it easy or difficult to write?
I loved it, because as far as I'm concerned, part of the fun has to be working with that, because, you've got to love all the suspects of, in Tinker Tailor. You've got to care about them. And you've got to feel that you know them. And so when you go back into Tinker Tailor, or you go into Tinker Tailor from here for the first time, you're kind of going, well, I already feel I know these people, so I don't want any of them to be the bad guy, and so, yeah, there's irony, but there's also one of the things that I do instinctively when I'm writing my books is when you meet the bad guy, there should always be something in you that makes you, or in them, that makes you go, oh, I get how you got to where you are. You're still a bad guy, but God, I can see that, I want you to believe, just as I want you to believe in the catastrophe of Anne and George's relationship, I want you to believe in the possibility that each of these people is the good guy or the bad guy.
I'm not surprised to hear you say that it was fun to write Bill, because that comes across completely on the page. It's so fun to read those sequences where he pops up. And I think you hit just the right amount. Did you have to cut anything out? Did you at one point think, oh, I've got too much Bill now, I need to sort of walk that back? Or
I think it was a pretty good balance. I mean, I always knew that we were leaving London. So leaving Bill kind of behind is very simple. And we know he's going somewhere important. You know, in the original books, he goes to Washington a great deal. He's focused on the Soviet nuclear threat. You know, I feel comfortable with him doing that travel, and he's not posted back into the UK until 1965 or so. You know, and so he's obviously on his way to do something tremendously important at this moment.
Nick, let me ask you this. This is pretty much a overarching question, but there is any question that anyone familiar with your father's work knows just how intricate it is. So what I was interested in is, clearly you were under a lot of pressure. I understand that. I mean, it's a huge undertaking. But forgetting about the pressure, I'd like to hear about the joy you must have felt while writing this book. What's it like to have a ticket to the circus and be able to create in a world of your father's imagination?
So it's fantastic. And this is, you know, the thing that I wanted from it, first of all, was the creative apprenticeship. I mean, that was really, for me, the thing that made it exciting and unmissable in the end, was the opportunity to sit, as it were, with him. I mean, you have this kind of, because we all watch the same movies, you have this kind of feeling that you should get Obi-Wan Kenobi kind of sitting opposite you in the chair, kind of going, yes, you know, remember the semicolon. You know, and he did not kind of magically appear, but what I got in a sense is better. I got to sit in his chair and feel the levers of the machine and come to understand them and operate them. And, you know, creatively, it's an incredible education. And, you know, that part of it is joyful on a personal level, on an emotional level. You know, and occasionally also a bit devastating. You know, there's some grief in the book as well. But in terms of, I mean, just the sheer fun of Esterhazy being outrageous, Gwilym being kind of perpetually horrified. You know, because, I mean, Gwilym's function is very often to be just kind of that slight beat behind and sort of go, but George, how can you possibly? And Smiley's going, no, you wait, it'll be fine. You know, and that sense that he's constantly, I mean, that's the level on which Gwilym is us, is we kind of, you know, we're not quite there with Smiley. We know we could be, but, you know, we're just struggling to make the leap to what Smiley's realized. You know, and then to be Smiley, to have all the answers, and to be able to put two splinters of oak into the lock above and below, and have them stay in when you go inside, you know, and know all the magic tricks. You know, that sense of holding the strings of the circus, you know, there is something incredibly appealing about being the omniscient narrator in one of these stories, where even the omniscient narrator doesn't tell you everything they know.
I really enjoyed your approach to writing about Munt, Nick, and, you know, giving Munt that Gegner, the enemy, the fiend, that he's also living with that paranoia. Because you kind of look at him almost as this perfect double, but you shared with us some of his concerns. How was it writing Munt?
Writing Munt is kind of horrible, because you don't, on the one hand, you have to generate a degree of interest in him, but you don't want to sympathize with that guy because he is a monster. So, you know, you need to have him occupy a kind of uncanny valley where you recognize him as being an exciting character, but you also are repelled by him. And the repulsion becomes, you know, kind of sticky. You know, you can't quite let him go. And then also one of the challenges in doing this is, to some degree, you can't show Karla. You know, Karla has always got to be the shark. And obviously Munt details having an encounter with Karla, but it's Munt. So how much of it is true? How much of it is Munt's paranoia? How much of it is he making up to impress Smiley? There's a degree, again, of the fog of espionage. You can take it as absolutely true, but Smiley's not prepared to accept it that way. So that whole sequence, you kind of, here you've got somebody who scares Munt. Here you've got Munt putting one over on Karla, and yet you don't know how much of it's real. And by the by, Munt is happily sacrificing someone who works down the hall and just throwing them under the bus. You know, and so, I mean, writing the monster is usually great fun. in this case, it felt more jagged, and it should, because of who he is. But it was definitely, in terms of craft, in terms of the intricacy of it, is one of the really interesting parts of it for me.
I'm interested in that creative apprenticeship you talked about a moment ago, because from your introduction to the book, it sounds like that almost goes back to childhood. Like you grew up with these characters more than your brothers, and did you have conversations in the family about Smiley as a real person?
So this is the interesting thing. And so here's the first thing, which I hadn't really realized until relatively recently. I mean, like literally in the last month, and which isn't in the introduction to the book. I was born in 1972. The Smiley stories were running from then through into the 1980s because there was the screenplays and so on. And my dad would read the books to my mother, read the new pages to my mother all the time. In the morning over breakfast, when I came home from school, when I was going to school in the evening time, I'd come back and it would be going on. But so what that means is that I literally learned to speak English in part by hearing Smiley read aloud. So when I came to do this, I talk about turning the creative dial, to be a little bit more le Carré-like. It wasn't very many notches before it felt very natural. So that's the first thing. And as you say, in that sense, you get the apprenticeship from very early on. But we barely ever talked about writing, like overtly, concretely. I think I can count on my fingers, like with one hand, the number of times that we actually talked about the craft of writing in any depth. And I'm having a conversation at Waterstones in Piccadilly in November with Philippe Sands, and Philippe was a buddy of my dad's, and is a friend of mine. And they did have an overt conversation about how they approached writing books. And Philippe has a list of like the things that he thinks that, that dad said that were interesting and so on. So like, how do I not have the list? One of the things I'm going to do is like, I'm going to take a notebook to that event. I'm going to write that list down, because as he was enumerating them, we were walking together recently and he was listening. I was like, well, I do that. And I do that too, but I hadn't really thought about doing that way and so on. And, and I did a lot of learning by osmosis and by example. And in doing this book, much more of that, like kind of, this is turning the faucet all the way open and, and standing in the stream, but without the actual iterated how to do it list. So, I wanted to stand under the waterfall of how Smiley works and kind of, and do that. But now I'm also greedy. I want like the list.
Nick, let me ask you about this. Going through the book, there were a lot of unexpected touches. Some were really exciting. Some were only le Carré geeks would really get. But maybe the most surprising thing about anything I saw in the book were these 4 words: George Smiley, action hero. This is something I just didn't see coming. All of a sudden, seeing Smiley leave the confines of the circus and being robust in the field, which was really a terrific touch. Where does that come from?
It's not really by choice, is it? He kind of gets shoehorned into it. He doesn't really approve when he's doing it. But yeah, well, Smiley had to cross a line. He had to go out on a limb. We had to see him exposed. You can't be, and he does do that in Smiley's People. He goes to the water camp and he feels he's in danger. In the first Smiley story ever, he gets beaten up by Munt, he does expose himself to danger. But at this point, it's already, he's already not allowed to do that quite clearly. He knows too much. He can't afford to be captured. So he's crossing a line. I wanted to expose him to jeopardy directly. I wanted him over on the other side of the Iron Curtain, however briefly, even if he never does it again, because we need to see at this moment in his life, we need to see and feel his tradecraft, see him, functioning on the edge, not with a plan, not as a detective, but as someone who's doing a thing because they feel obligated to do it. Doesn't matter that it's probably a bad idea. It just gives you something about him. And at the same time, you cannot have a situation where he kicks a door down and points a gun at somebody. It's so not him. So I had to give him a way of demonstrating his ability in the field, which we hear about as something he did during the war, but we never see. And just give him, as with everybody, you give them a little bit of extra space to be themselves and to show you who they are, which is, if this book does nothing else, it has to do that.
That's well, along those lines, I found it amusing that you gave Sam Collins the backstory that kind of mirrors your dad's often recounted upbringing. Was that just an Easter egg for readers, as Stephen was saying? We're these big nerds of this, or do you in some way equate your father with that character? And did any other bits of family history like make it into the book, intentionally or otherwise?
I mean, I think to some extent, well, so first of all, I think to some extent, all the characters in the book in his books and in mine have echoes of him, like inevitably. Sam is talked about as being a potential successor to Smiley. There's a conversation in Tinker Tailor about how he's certainly devious enough to be part of a Russian spy ring. They don't entirely trust him. He's cold enough. He's very alarming and honorable schoolboy. He's quite a tough character. And I just liked the idea of him being here for us in this story and demonstrating a little bit of that. And yeah, I mean, giving him, touches of my dad's backstory. To some extent, though, my dad talked about all the people he knew in, or put it another way, the ideal recruit to SIS being to some extent a kind of wolf child, like, somebody who's looking for structure that they didn't have, doesn't trust the authority figures that have been offered to them, but wants one, and so on, so that you can create an almost pathological loyalty to the circus, which allows, or to SIS, which allows them then notionally to do things, to betray people they will have to persuade that they are friends, and so on. And that sort of made sense to me. So then, to some degree, they're all going to have some kind of slightly non-standard childhood, because they come through, even if it's just, the UK's boarding school system at that time, which, took kids from the age of 5. And I can't remember who I was talking to, who said, the thing is that what happens is you choose between your family and the school in terms of love, because it's too painful to love both. So you pick one, you pick the other. And the thing is, you spend more time at school. So what you're creating is institutionalized children who are then raised as adults, and their task is to run the British Empire, which by this time is already falling away. So they don't have a job anymore. There's a real kind of Lost Boys aspect to this. So yeah, I gave Sam a little touch of my dad's life, but to some extent that's sort of a little bit ubiquitous. There's very few kind of stable, coherent homes in the le Carré universe, I think.
Nick, let's talk a little bit about George and Anne. Their relationship is so important to the Smiley Karla story, and yet really there isn't all that much written about them. But I think what you did was really very interesting. You write about them briefly. Their scenes are very moving. But what it does is it goes a long way into providing some insight into why the relationship unfolds as it does in the subsequent books. Was fleshing out their story a specific aim of yours, or was it just a natural outgrowth of telling your story?
I think it was both. I definitely wanted Anne to have, again, some time to be who she is, and to, and because when I talk to people about the Smiley stories, when I was in the run up to this, one of the things I said is, does Anne love George? And nobody has any doubt that she does. Like, it doesn't work. The relationship is a catastrophe, but he loves her and she loves him. So how does that go that wrong? And, and then it seems to me, okay, well, then if there's that much kind of between them, there's a story there which is worth telling. And here we are, just that somehow their relationship ought to work, but doesn't. And this is how. And my parents had to some extent a relationship that shouldn't have worked but did. So this is the flip side. It's they have everything going for them, and yet somehow it's just broken.
That's really interesting. We've talked a lot about how you of things that you brought in from your father's work, but of course there's an equal part in this that's original that you're bringing that's totally fresh to this world. You mentioned having the ability to incorporate history now, which he didn't have. I think this is the first time ever in a circus book that we've heard about the sister service, since your dad sort of melded MI5 and MI6 into one to talk about all his experiences. So that was really interesting. But even more interesting thing, he took a lot of criticism over his female characters, and you seem to have made a concerted effort to have a lot more women in the circus and involved in the story. Did you do any research of reading like autobiographies of women who had served at that time, or did you talk to people who had been officers then? How did you feel about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, so I did do that. I mean, I didn't go and talk to people who'd been officers. I did read some of the biographies, and of course there are fewer of those, right? Because all the boys went off and wrote biographies about how clever they were. And when the women of Bletchley Park, for example, which is a different but related thing, it took until not actually that long ago for anyone to admit they existed, for them to come out of the woodwork and say, yes, we were there, and then they all got medals and so on. But, it's fascinating. Just, I remember listening to the BBC, like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and hearing the first of those stories come out, and someone say, no, we had no idea that Aunt Beryl worked at Bletchley Park, but now we've just found all this stuff, code-breaking gear and so on. There are photographs of her with Turing and so on. And that was that made a great deal of sense to me, that that they were right there, but they were just really quiet about it. And then it was very conveniently erased. And I mean, my dad used to talk about, and you have a very strong, undiscussed sense of the women in the circus, most of whom are the mothers, who run the whole place. They keep it together. That they're fundamental and yet undiscussed, which is kind of typical of the moment. And then you have Connie, and you have Connie's section, and so on. So that they're there, but they're not. And when I came to look at it, it turned out that a lot of women in SOE then went on, first of all, the SOE kind of form of words was the role nurse, the nursing auxiliary, and so a lot of people who were in SOE were kind of notionally nursing auxiliary people, and then they then went on and worked in and around government and intelligence, so on. So it was all there, waiting to happen. I just felt that, if you have Millie McCraig as this kind of slightly more formidable character anyway, you can just do that in the world, and no one's surprised by it, because to some extent, nobody would have been. Of course, those formidable women were there because there have always been formidable women. So it didn't seem like such a stretch to me. And by the time he was writing later in the post-Cold War novels, he was, by then working very hard to produce plausible, proactive women, who were the women essentially that he knew around him and whom he admired. It was in the earlier books, they're not there. Although, then again, Elsa Fenton is formidable. She's extraordinary. It's a complex conversation, but for me, it was just wide open. It was just right there. We'll do this, and we can open this world to a slightly less a cast of characters who can basically wear each other's jackets. We can do more than this, and that's not in any way to diminish what exists. It's just to say, here we are. We can have this kind of fun too.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mention his later, because obviously, it becomes very evident that he's putting women front and center more later on. And in a lot of ways with Susanna, we kind of get an idea of little drummer girl retrofitted into the kind of boys club of the circus, because she's very much a co-lead of this book, if not the main character. We sort of start with her. how did you build her character? And did you draw from some of those other later examples of his more sort of proactive female characters?
I was just confident that it would work. And so I just wrote her as she needed to be, and she has a story. This is the other thing that kind of fascinates me about doing this is we in the UK, when we teach history, when we teach European history of the 20th century, we tell it inevitably from a London-centric, UK-centric point of view. We don't really, and I mean that in that order, right? It starts with London, and even if you're learning the history of the UK from another place, you're still going to get a London-centric viewpoint because that's where Westminster is, and mysteriously, that's where people believe it all happens. People in Westminster. But, so you get this very single viewpoint version of history. And the other countries like Hungary, each of them also do that. So if you're in a Hungarian school, you learn the history of the 20th century, it's going to look really different from how it looks in London. And we are really weirdly blind to that still. And so Susanna, as a Hungarian emigre, as a woman in London, as somebody who's not a natural circus recruit, but who's just fallen into it, has her own perspective on everything. And for example, like she meets Bill Hayden, and within about 12 seconds, she knows exactly who and what he is. She has absolutely no doubt about it. And, nobody ever asks her. But actually, if they took that kind of encapsulated perception that she has, they would not be a million miles away from what happens, in Hayden's life. And I feel like you can just, with Susanna, you can just kind of follow the logic of her situation. And each time she encounters something, you learn more about her, and she learns more about her. She's actually been in abeyance while she's been working for Laszlo Banati. She hasn't really done anything yet except survive and recover from a kind of a traumatic flight from her home country. And she's just got her feet under her, really. And here is Mickey Bortnick in the beginning of this story. And she begins to discover, oh, actually, I haven't left all that behind. That's still in me, which I think is, I think is the experience of being that person. You can leave a lot of things behind, but you also take them with you.
Nick, a more esoteric question, something that I find it didn't appear to me right off the bat, but when I started to think about it, it sort of reared its head a little bit. When I got the book, I read it twice very quickly. First, I just wanted to see what in the world you possibly could achieve. What exactly is this?
That question.
Right. And then the second time I read it, a week later, I really just wanted to see how you did it. That's kind of the way I did it. And it was interesting because both times I read it, I had different perspectives on it. So I'm trying not to get into spoiler territory. I know we've discussed this. So I'll just try to hint around the edges. In your view, is Karla's choice a spy story driven by love or a love story set in the world of espionage? Because we have Roca and his family, George and Anne. We have Karla and, let's say, his mentor. We have Susanna and Tom. We have Smiley and the circus. What is this book?
Yeah. So I think all these stories are stories about people first. And then you get the context that they're in. And the context then takes you into espionage and so on. But I guess the fundamental point about characters in the Le Carré universe is that they are human in the first instance, and they are humans who are spies, or they're humans who are whatever they are, but they cannot dislocate their humanity from the profession that they're in, and so there's always a tension there. And as you go through the sequence, start wherever you like, but finish with Smiley's people. Ultimately that tension is massively consequential for Karla and indeed for Smiley and so on. So in this context, I guess is it a spy story driven by love, or is it a love story set in the world of spying? My dad would say spying is love and love is spying. That you can't separate the two. My concern was to inhabit the world as fully as I could and to tell a story. And so by definition, it's a spy story. And by definition, it's a story about human love and compassion and so on.
It's interesting, Stephen, that you read the book twice in quick succession. So I've read the book once, and now I'm excited to listen to the audio book on my walks here and to listen to the book and see how it unfolds in my mind as well. Very excited for that. Matthew. Oh.
No, I was just going to say I'm excited for the audiobook too. Simon Russell Beale is, that was a huge thing for me. And I really want to hear it. So I'm fascinated.
Yeah, I can't wait for the audio version too. I also I've read it once and I want to revisit it that way, especially with Beale. One of my favorite passages in the book is you're talking about European countries and you say there's only now and it goes back forever, which is a great phrase, but also a great way to think about those countries. But it's also a way to think about what you're doing with the circus, because you're dealing with contemporary themes. A lot of this book could be applied to the current geopolitics, especially with Russia and Europe. But then you're also setting it in the 60s and in this point in Smiley's timeline. And you talked at the beginning about how you could, there's other points like when he's the head of the service and honorable schoolboy that you could go to. If you were to do more, do you think you would jump around and do that, or maybe even the time between Smiley's people and Secret Pilgrim when he might be debriefing Karla or whatever? Or do you think you would continue kind of a straightforward narrative from here, continuing in this pre-Tinker Tailor time span?
I think there's a bunch of things you could do. You could say, we will tell the story of the time that runs from here into Tinker Tailor, but we'll tell it off track. So we'll go to Perciala Line in the Middle East. We'll go to Gwilym and Esterhazy in Switzerland. We'll do those, and we'll look from outwards into what's happening in London. I have my eye on 1965 right now, which is a kind of a pivotal year in the circus's kind of development through this sequence. A lot of things start or end in 65, which I think is just liminal spaces are always interesting. I think, it's overall, it's kind of, I have a sense of what the overarching concern has to be to make it make sense to do more stories into that time, and how you kind of contend with the fact that you're going to end with Tinker Tailor. You've got to segue into that. It has to feel right. And incidentally, just forgive me if I just go off topic a second. Apropos of that, there's a really interesting thing which I found when I was doing this, where the first 3 books have a much less ornamented, much more noirish style, which my dad talked about. He said, this is what civil service reports are like, 400 words, no adjectives. And that's how he learned to write, he says, and then you go to Tinker Tailor and you're dealing with a much more ornamented, elusive style and so on. And it's much longer and more involuted and convoluted in terms of plotting. And Karla's Choice kind of has to sit in the middle, So as you go forwards from here, the stories have to get, and the language has to get a little bit more dense and involved in order to make that jump possible. So there's a whole other consideration there, which I'm kind of, I'm looking forward to, I guess. It's interesting, Stephen said he's read the book twice. I habitually write books with the intention that you should be able to read them again and get something new. That there's enough kind of layering that when you go back, you'll go, you cheeky, yeah, you've done a thing, and because I like that. I like the idea, because I read books over and over again if I like them. So I want to leave something there for you that you might pick up the second time around.
Let me pick up on something that Matthew said, because I think when you read a book like this, there inevitably are going to be passages that really resonate with you. And Matthew brought that up, and that was really a great scene. One of the things that I really liked about it was, and I think one of the things you did really brilliantly in the book is you provided context for readers who really know your father's work. And this is what really struck me. I think every le Carré lover, if they asked what were the most iconic lines, would be pretty much when Karla walked over the bridge. And Willem says to Smiley, George, you won. And Smiley says, yes, I suppose I did. And that's always like stood in space. And then all of a sudden, you created a bookend to that, which I never really felt it needed. And this was after the events at the end of the book, when Control says to George, so that's how it ends. And Smiley then replies, no, not ends, not just yet. And to me, that sets the stage. We have the 3 books. Now that last section when he walks across the bridge, those lines really resonate a little deeper. Did you just plan on doing that? Because it was really brilliant.
I wanted always, at any opportunity that I could, I wanted it to be the case that something that if I had the opportunity, something I did in Karla's Choice would only deepen the experience of Tinker Tailor. And conversely, you cannot have a situation where something in Karla's Choice diminishes Tinker Tailor. That is the kind of the absolute nightmare. So you step around anything that's a reveal in Tinker Tailor. You can elucidate the things that are hinted at. And as with Karla, as I was saying earlier, he's the shark in the movie. You can't see the shark too clearly. You can see the ripples and you can hear about how many people he's eaten. That's fine, but you should never get clear sense that what he's like, what he's going to do. You can have a sense of his motivation, but you have to doubt yourself. So there's 2 things going on constantly. There's, on the one hand, I want to show you things and I want you to feel, oh yeah, that's why that happens later. Or, oh, now that I see that, yes, I get that. And on the other hand, I want to hide this from you. And I want you to feel actually that it's more hidden than it was before. Like, how can he do that? How is this person who is capable of this also capable of this? That seems impossible. And yet, people change. They develop over time, subjected to stress. They make poor decisions. One thing in one moment can define a life, and yet you can try to reverse it and so on. So that you should feel that these people are capable of radical reversal, and change, because that keeps the possibility of events being unpredictable in any story that I choose to tell. Because the big danger, aside from kind of messing up the continuity, the big danger is that the continuity is so strong that you don't feel there can be anything new.
Well, I have a question that's not not directed at the author Nick Harkaway, but at the someone who grew up in the family of John le Carré, because we would always see on the dust jackets these pictures of him and his dogs. And I grew up in a family with whippets. We always had whippets. And even before I started reading him, I remember when I would give his books to my dad as Christmas presents, because that's what he asked for, and I'd see the picture on the back of your dad with a whippet. I would feel this automatic kindred spirit, here. And I know he had other breeds of dogs too. And Shane's had greyhounds. So I was wondering, what was the relationship with dogs like in the family? They seemed such a part of that.
See, I think it was actually a Bedlington Whippet, but it was presented to us as being a dog with 1,000 different varieties involved, on the Russia House, which I saw the jacket of, they had that photograph with him walking on the beach with the dog, and that's Whisper, the second dog. I actually now have a Bedlington Whippet as well. And, we have, and she is remarkable. And so my dad's dogs were anarchic. He wanted them to be anarchic, and I really believe that they respond to that. So they were, they were loving, and they were also a complete pain in everyone's backside. And they would steal food off the table, and, they were absolute chaos. And they adored him, and they adored my mother. And, so the relationship was very positive, but very anarchic. It's actually really interesting that you bring that up, because one of the things we're developing the kind of the le Carré social media presence, because there's never been one, because he hated the internet. Or not, he didn't hate the internet, but he wasn't interested in doing any of that. And one of the things I wanted to do was kind of dogs of le Carré. because he had an Old English sheepdog, and then he had those two dogs, and that was it. They were so devastated when the second one of the Whippets died that they couldn't bear it anymore. So I now have that to carry on. But yeah, I would love to do kind of Whippets of le Carré.
Brilliant. Yeah, me too.
All right, we have a couple of minutes left. I just had two quick questions. The first one was just really on the publishing side of things. Clearly, this book has a huge potential built-in audience. My question is, what about readers not familiar with your father's work? You think this book can get them on board? And do you think that this book resonates purely as a standalone?
So I like to think that because, as you say, it has this kind of element of, is it a love story set in an espionage? Is it a story of love set in an espionage environment, or is it an espionage story? I feel like the human characters in it are sufficiently enlivened and compelling on their own that it can be approached as a standalone, or at least approached as a gateway into the le Carré canon. My immediate hope is not that it would ever be a standalone, but that if you read it, you will immediately go and read all the other books. Because that was also part of the point of the whole thing in the first place was, when we inherited my father's kind of literary estate, the injunction upon us is to broaden the reach and to ensure that it continues to be read. And, in this world of book publishing in which we now live, that's no longer a random thing. In the Victorian period, it may have been kind of quasi-random who ends up being read 50, 100 years later. But for us now, it's a question of resources and focus, and making a big enough imprint on the mind of the world at any given time that someone's going to kind of say, yeah, actually, we should reread those. Those are important. And so, so what I want is for it to be a standalone and yet pull you inexorably into the whole stretch of the story. And, I have to believe that it can do that because, that's who I am.
Can I just ask the last question? Because I know that Shane and Matthew and everyone at Spybrary basically wants to know the answer to this question. It's the ultimate fanboy, and I'm not embarrassed to ask it. In Silverview, in your afterword, you happen to have mentioned that A Delicate Truth was the perfect distillation of your father's work. So I want to know here and now, indeed, what is Nick Harkaway's favorite John le Carré book?
Oh, that's so hard.
Yeah.
I know, that's why I'm asking.
That's so hard. Because genuinely, because they're not just books in my life. They're kind of pieces of life. So like Single and Single reminds me of my brother Tim, but I was the juggler, right? So the whole book, I absolutely kind of I see glittering reflections of real life in it all the time, and it's such a fun book. So there's that one, and then like you say, Delicate Truth to me is the moment which he kind of nailed his own writing. Like he understood it perfectly, looked back along the line, and wrote this actually quite devastating, really exciting thriller. And I love that book. But for me, the books of my childhood are the le Carré novels. They have to be. So, in a sense, it's the Tinker Tailor sequence that has to be, that has to be my favorites, even though if I was going on a desert island, I might take Single and Single out of love. It's an impossible question, specifically for the kids, or for my father's kids. It's just kind of, because they all have these interwoven meanings. But in terms of story, I think it has to be the Smiley trilogy. It's just amazing.
Nick, I have to say, my favorite is Absolute Friends, and I just reread it. I finished it this morning, third time, because I'm on Jeff's Le Carré cast soon to talk about it. And again, just the third time of reading this, it's just like, these are the qualities, and I'll spill all on Jeff's podcast why I love this book. It just leaves me in it's hard to describe the emotions I feel when I get to the end of Absolute Friends.
Absolute Friends has its own strand of heritage within the le Carré canon. You have Our Game and Absolute Friends, and arguably Night Manager and Single are kind of in that space as well. They're sort of, and I guess it's the Perfect Spy strand. They're sort of stories of sort of one-on-one male friendships with these kind of incredible consequences. You know, and it's the peak of betrayal as love, which is very much kind of theme. Yeah, I mean that I didn't mention it. It's a great choice.
Not a lot of people do, unfortunately, but after my appearance of Le Carré cast, everyone's going to run out and read Shefflin's after Karla's choice.
But this is the great thing. I mean, you know, it's always a toss up. Who loves what and which Le Carré book? And you go into a bookshop. Certainly, you go into a bookshop anywhere near me, and there's a high chance that you'll see Tinker Tailor and Smiley's People, but not The Honourable Schoolboy, because some people just kind of skip that one. And yet, for a lot of people, Honourable Schoolboy is the fundamental. It's the most complex. It's the most layered. It's also got a kind of hot war component. It's brutal. It's distressing. It's dazzling. You know, and they get really kind of excited about it. You know, and so it's the question of like, which one do you love? I honestly, when I went back through them all, through all the Smiley novels, I was struck by how amazing Call for the Dead is. Like, it's his first book. It's short. It's punchy. It's got all kinds of things going on. It's actually brutal about England, about kind of, so many things. I find it, you know, fascinating. And this is why I get excited a little bit about Delicate Truth, because I think it, you know, Delicate Truth and Silverview, and look back at the first three books and make a kind of really serious sort of statement of where we are now versus where we were then. I will never be sufficiently academic to write that appreciation, but I'm nonetheless intrigued by it.
Marvelous. I can't think of a better way to end our conversation than to invite Stephen to share his story about the day he met your dad, John le Carré.
Yeah, Nick, this is thanks, Shane, for giving me the opportunity, because I'll probably never have it again. Nick, I just wanted to tell you that I've been collecting your father and reading your father for over 40 years, and he's been a very big part of my life. And in 1996, I live in New York, and in 1996, he came to New York City to promote the Tailor of Panama. And he was speaking at the 92nd Street Y, which is just a mile away from where I am. And I knew that I would never have an opportunity. Now, what I had in my hand at that time, I have the most pristine UK first edition of Call for the Dead. And I knew, my God, if I could ever get close to your dad, to have him sign this book. So when they promoted it, they made it very clear he would not sign anything other than if you purchased a copy of the Tailor of Panama. And I was lucky because it was the winter. So I hid the book under my jacket, and I bought my second copy of A Tailor of Panama. And if I ever had any designs of being a secret agent, just moving along the line, hiding Call for the Dead under my jacket, I was sweating bullets.
Yeah.
So I finally got to the line. You probably know this thing.
I mean, I know that, yeah.
Yeah. And and he has this handler, this PR handler, and it finally becomes my turn. And I'm not sure how to handle this. The woman looks up at me. I simply open my jacket, and he saw that bright yellow Galance jacket. And the woman came immediately to me and said, "Sir, you obviously are not reading the signs. He will not sign anything." And all of a sudden, your father put his hand on hers. He quieted her. He beckoned me forth. He looked at me and he said, "I'm guessing," under those beautiful bushy eyebrows, he looked at me and said, "I'm guessing either you want me to buy this or sign it for you." And I remember saying, "If you would sign this book to me, this would be one of the great moments of my life." And he said, "Of course." And he signed it. And I'm telling you, for 2 weeks afterwards, I don't remember anything. It was one of the great moments of my life. So I am here to thank you personally as his son. It was a great, great moment, and he showed me great kindness.
Oh, thank you. Well, that was him. He would always break the rules for kindness. That was definitely, he was not good at following restrictions if there was something that needed to be done, as it were. I love it. That's great.
Good. I'm glad you heard the story.
Yeah, and I hope you'll sign my copy, because I'm coming to Waterstones Piccadilly on the 14th of November. A few more listeners are coming, so we'll see you then, Nick.
Yeah, no, that'll be great. I'm, as you see, genuinely really excited about that event. I think it's going to be amazing.
Absolutely. Marvelous. Well, Nick, thanks a million for coming on to Spybrary today. It's a huge honor for all of us. And thanks a million for writing this epic book. I can't wait to listen to it again. As soon as it's out on Audible, I'm out there getting my steps in listening.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me.
Marvelous. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Nick Harkaway. I know that I did. If it didn't show in that interview, in that conversation, I absolutely love Karla's choice. I was really, really nervous going into it, right? Because it's a huge challenge to write. George Smiley is as famous as James Bond when it comes to spying, right? And in some quarters, maybe even more well-known. So to take something that we all love and we cherish and to write a novel, I think, a George Smiley novel, I think where Nick was really clever was sandwiching it in between two books. You had that existing timeline. His intimate knowledge of his father's work really shines through, but it doesn't veer into pastiche. You're not reading a mini le Carré here. Harkaway is a very talented writer. On finishing this, my first thought was, more, Nick, we want more of this. And then I went and cooked a goulash for reasons that you'll find out when you read the book. I hope you enjoyed that interview. Come join us in our Spybrary community. Share with us what you think about it. You can find that at spybrary.com/community. And listen, if you're on the fence, right? Or if you're like one of those Star Wars fans when the new movies come out, I'm not watching that, it's sacrosanct. Do me a favor. If you've got anything out of Spybrary in the last 8 years, go order the book. Give it 100 pages. I guarantee you'll be reading the whole thing because it's an outstanding piece of work. I absolutely love Karla's choice, and I really want to see more from Nick Harkaway. This is Shane Whaley for Spybrary.